Before we get started, please remember this podcast is for general educational purposes only. We're not providing medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always consult your own healthcare provider about your care. Welcome to Fertility Nurses Unfiltered. 2 nurses, 1 mic, no bullshit.
I'm Ashley LaRue, fertility nurse and founder of Fertility.
And I'm Laura Wepler, fertility nurse and founder of Navigating Fertility with Laura.
You got questions, the internet has a lot of opinions, but what you really need is 2 fertility nurses who aren't afraid to tell the truth.
No scripts, no sugarcoating, just honest, evidence-based nurse-to-nurse conversation. So let's get into it. Hey everyone, welcome back to this week's episode of Fertility Nurses Unfiltered. As always, Ashley and I are super excited to be with you this week. Today's conversation is one that I think is really needed in the fertility space and probably one that we don't have often and enough. We're going to be talking a little bit about fertility stress in the relationship. You know, I think a lot of times we're so focused on what's happening with the partner who's going through the physical treatment, typically the female partner. And a lot of times the spouse is maybe forgotten or not, the mental health of what's happening with the partner or the spouse is not talked about enough. And certainly we've talked on this podcast numerous times about how I think it looks really different on both sides. And I think particularly men are often forgotten in the conversation. And so excited to get into this. Today's guest is the founder of Calla Collective, a highly specialized therapist dedicated to reproductive mental health with extensive experience. Batya Novick guides individuals and couples through the complexities of fertility challenges, prenatal loss, family building transitions, postpartum experiences, and the menopausal journey. She is a licensed clinical social worker whose career has been wholly committed to providing compassionate and expert care in this vital field. She's a graduate of Columbia University with advanced training from the Ackerman Institute for the Family, and she's held a professorship at NYU's Silver School of Social Work, shaping the next generation of clinicians. Batya is an active member of Resolve and has served as an elected committee member within the mental health professional group of the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. Beyond her clinical practice, she offers clinical support and consultations to corporations and various industries, is a published author, and a frequent speaker on fertility and women's health, sharing her expertise widely. Today, we're talking about something that doesn't get nearly enough airtime: what fertility struggles do to a relationship, and how couples can get through it together instead of quietly drifting apart. So welcome, Batya. Thank you so much for joining us. I would love for you to give us an introduction in your own words.
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this topic because, to your point, we don't talk about it enough. But to go backwards, a little bit about who I am and who the Calla Collective is. So I'm a therapist, and as you've said, Laura, I specialize in reproductive mental health. And I had my own fertility journey while I was also specializing in maternal and reproductive mental health. And it was shocking because I knew a lot, but then as a patient didn't know much of anything. And I was sitting in a fertility clinic. I mean, this was 2010, so it was a while ago. And nobody was talking about how we were getting through this. It felt extremely lonely and depressing. There wasn't any social media. And you'd sit in a clinic with other people who were obviously going through it, but you felt so alone. And I remember talking to my physician at the time going, what is going on? If this was oncology, we would have some therapists walking around. We would have like a mental health advocate. And he said, yeah, you should do something. And I said, I'm so doing something. So from that came the Calla Collective. And while there are wonderful, amazing therapists that specialize in fertility, a lot of them specialize in many things: fertility, eating disorders, X, Y, and Z. And at Calla Collective, we exclusively focus on reproductive health, from people and couples through preconception, from diagnoses of PCOS and endometriosis or oncofertility issues, all the way to people trying to conceive struggling with fertility, dealing with IUIs, IVF, pregnancy losses, third party surrogacy donor, or exploring childless by choice, all the way to pregnancies and postpartum and perimenopause. It's really the life cycle that we go through. And this is all we do. We work with individuals and couples, and we work with folks across all 50 states, and we have physical offices in New York and Miami. And one thing that's really special about what we do in this line of work is you can't just talk about the emotional experience without also helping people navigate the experience, which is so much of what you do. And so we really help people figure out how to navigate that intersection of who am I, what do I need, what are my emotional needs, and how do I anticipate all of this? And so it's really unique, specialized care. And I think the couple and partners really go, to your point, unnoticed a lot. And it adds a lot of stressors that sometimes we can examine in other ways and really help alleviate some of that stress so we can just focus on the fertility stress.
Amazing.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I agree with you. I think there's so many wonderful mental health professionals out there, but there aren't a lot that only specialize and have really studied and trained outside of potentially just having their own journey, which I think is valuable in and of itself. You bring a very unique perspective that you can very much understand what that person is going through, right? So I think that's great. But I agree with you. I think having a little bit deeper knowledge on the actual experience, you can just speak a different language. You can, I don't know, it just goes deeper. So greatly respect what you guys are doing at Calla Collective and love it, obviously, and love that you're, changing the game and that you're available in all 50 states, which is not always the case either. It's so hard to, as Laura and I also work in all 50 states. It's hard to find, really good, solid people because you can't meet everybody. You can't meet every professional in the space. So it's nice to have, conversations like this. So, and resources like this available to, people in the community. So absolutely love what you're doing. In regards to relationships, to kind of kick us off, do you see or do you feel that it is like the chicken or the egg kind of thing, right? Is it their fertility brings out relationship struggles and just kind of brings them to the surface more so? Or do you think that fertility journeys cause more of the relationship struggles, right? Like which came first, the chicken or the egg? And it may not be a one size fits all, obviously, but would love your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably both. I think what we find a lot are couples who, before struggling with fertility, were struggling with communication, were struggling with kind of expectations in life. Well, then the stressor of fertility challenges blows those other relational stressors out of the water. It just over magnifies it. Also, if one partner is more ambivalent about family building, having a child than the other, the stressor then that fertility challenges can cause um, can really exacerbate those relational stressors. That being said, we see a lot of couples that are like, we were fine. There were no problems. And maybe the relational stressor isn't as severe as the folks coming in already with some challenges, but it's also quite hard. It's a lot more of I don't think he understands, or I don't think I'm expressing myself well. So it's maybe a lower grade challenge relationally, but I mean, I think the stress from fertility, right? Like the studies have shown us are the same as the stress cancer causes. But I think one of the problems that, on a baseline that couples struggle with is they're not honoring that this is a big, big life altering stress. God forbid, if somebody had cancer, right? You would expect, oh my God, they're struggling. That couple is struggling. But when you're going through fertility challenges, oftentimes the couple, the individuals are not even acknowledging this is huge. And certainly society, family, friends aren't either. So if we're not even acknowledging this is so hard, this is so stressful, then we're kind of like bulldozing through the experience. And that, I think that's one of the big baseline challenges I see a lot of couples go through.
Yeah, and certainly with that, I mean, I think, somebody gets a cancer diagnosis, they're probably more apt to share that with family and friends and ask for help.
Right.
Whereas, I mean, we all encounter so many couples who have kept it so close to the chest. And I think some of those reasons are valid, right? We can have family members who are, constantly asking us for updates, and then that just leaves us with more stress and more, we feel like if we're not successful, we've also failed our family and our friends. Where I think that's viewed very differently when there's a cancer diagnosis, and you want people to wrap around you and people want to wrap around you. But in fertility, sometimes our family and friends just don't know what to say, and that just
Exactly.
compounds it.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think there are times where it makes sense not to really share it to anyone or to too many people. I always try to tell couples you can't be everything to each other, right? Like, so if it's not your family, do you have one friend that you can talk to? Do you have somebody that's gone through something like this? Even if you're not your best friend. But there are certainly times and reasons why it's really appropriate not to share. I mean, sometimes you just aren't going to get the support you want, or you're not ready to disclose this. Or at times people will say, well, for example, we'll see either if there's a male factor issue, the other partner doesn't want to like disclose that to their family or friends, or vice versa. For the partner, they're like, well, that's what she's going through. Like, I don't really want to talk about that. And there's a lot of shame that can happen. So, but a couple can't be everything. And that's when we see things get harder, is when we're trying to make that relationship be the complete isolated island.
Yeah, and I think back to what, Laura, what you just said about, if you're not disclosing, you feel like you're failing your friends and your family members if you do disclose that or something, and then they know you're going through this. But I think that's also for each other, right? I think there's aspects where you feel like you're failing each other, especially if maybe there's a diagnosis on one side versus another. You feel like you're failing your family that you're trying to build, or your relationship in general, your significant other that you decided to go through life with. And I can only imagine, like, if you're not talking about that, how that just it sort of just starts eating away at that connection.
I mean, I see so many happily coupled people, right? Like healthy relationships where especially in like heteronormative couples, right? The wife, the woman is like, I'm broken, I'm failed, like I can't do this thing. And that grief is so palpable. Her body's broken so much trust with her that she will say in inflected, stressful moments, he should just find somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah.
When and sometimes he'll like the husband, the partner will be sitting there and be like, I don't want anybody else. I want you. Like, and so it's really that when we feel that something is wrong with one, like when one of the people in the couple feels like something's wrong with them and that this is their fault, it puts so much pressure on them that they're not enough, there's inadequacy, more shame, more blame, when oftentimes that other person in the relationship isn't thinking or feeling that way. It's such internalized shame. And whether there's a diagnosis or even what we often see is just unexplained infertility, which is so hard, right? Uncertainty is the worst from a mental health perspective. And it really can impact the couple in a bad way because they're like, we're just, how do we get through this? And there's so much internalized blame that often the woman starts to have for herself. Something automatically is wrong with me. This is my problem. And it starts to corrode the relationship. Even really happy ones, those like dark thoughts creep in, even if we're not saying them out loud. Which really the theme is like, I'm not enough.
Yeah. And this kind of on this same vein, like makes me think of someone that I had worked with recently, and she had severe endometriosis, multiple ectopics, cannot have children outside of IVF. And she is partnered with someone whose family is really all about like wanting grandchildren and like building a bigger family. And so she's feeling, I remember she expressed to me, she's feeling that stress from his family, but then in turn had expressed to me she's worried that maybe because of that a little bit that he might leave her, that he may want someone else. So exactly like you're talking to. And she verbalized, you know, he said no, that that's not the case. But I think, you know, even her hearing him say that, it's hard for her to, I think, internally accept, because it's like this dynamic. Everybody else in the family has kids. Why can't they?
Of course. And then we'll see for couples who are the first ones in their family to be trying, and then a younger sibling gets there first.
Yes.
And the couple experiences a sense of grief and failure and shame when that happens too. And it's really, it is really hard. I mean, I think there's a lot of family external pressures, right? Like we go into relationships and marriage just assuming our fertility,
Yeah.
because you go into your adolescence and young adult assuming your fertility. That's why people use birth control. There's an assumption, well, if we don't, we're gonna get pregnant or get somebody pregnant. So all that assumed fertility is such a trauma when it actually doesn't happen, when you can't get pregnant or you can't keep a pregnancy, or there's other diagnoses, right? It rocks that core belief that we've been raised with, and the core belief, whether we're like saying it out loud or not, that like part of why we're coupling up is to build a family. And it doesn't mean, you know, I'll tell people all the time, you know, I can't tell you when you're going to have a child or how you're going to have a child, but I can tell you if you want to have a child, you will have a child. Um, it's the how and the when that we're going to have to figure out. And I think that's a really big thing. And I think that's a really important thing couples can do together when they're both starting out in fertility struggles, and also in the deep, hard places, is to pull back and really say, what's the goal here? What are we trying to do? We want to have a child or children. Okay. Let's like keep that in mind. Let's figure out, like, do we need to pivot? Do we need to do something different? Do we need to just stay the course and just tolerate this really hard moment and really look at like, what's this goal for us all about? And sometimes you really need to do that, just like in other parts of life, whether it's work or sports. You know, you just have to kind of pull back and be like, what's the main objective? What's the goal here? And how do we reclaim this as like our goal as a couple?
Yeah. And going to your time thing too, I I can assume that, you know, time somewhat plays a factor in this too. Like in the beginning, maybe you are that cohesive front and you're somewhat like, hey, we're doing this. We're taking a proactive approach. We're going into fertility treatment. We figured out what's going on. We're going to have this family. And as we all know, fertility treatment can take months, years,
Yeah,
multiple cycles,
that's right.
all the things in all of that, right? So I can imagine that, you know, that resilience, I guess, for lack of a better word, in that relationship can almost like get a little bit more strained. And you could potentially have differing opinions as time goes on. Like you're on the same path to that same goal. And ultimately the goal is the same, but maybe the path, like one person wants the path maybe to look this way and the other person's like, no, we need to, you know, do this. And so I can imagine time being something you see a lot, as an added stressor and sort of compounds everything.
Time with relationships, time and financial stressors.
Yeah.
You know, some people are really lucky and fortunate that their employer coverage really like takes the financial burden away, or there's just enough financial stretch that this is not a worry. But for a lot of people, this is the biggest. I mean, in no other place where we're like, let's just set $20,000 on fire. Let's just burn 20 grand.
Yeah.
Like, what? No,
Yeah.
no, you get, that's a big amount of money, and to think you would spend that and see nothing for in that return is astronomical. So all these external pressures, to your point, time, and time is not just time, right? Like it's time and expectations. Your expectations, maybe your family or society expectations, and then for some, that financial burden can be incredibly hard. And that's why it's really important for couples to do really two things. One is three things. One is to acknowledge that this is an incredible stressor they're both going through. They might experience it differently, but they're both going through it. And to acknowledge how incredibly stressful this is. Never underplay it. Really, like, almost breathe more acknowledgement into the stress than you're thinking you are. Because most of the time people are underplaying it. Two is to really create time to sit down and talk about it. Not every day, maybe not every week, but I would say like once a month, like take a walk or sit and be like, how are you doing? How are you doing? How can I show up for you a little bit better? Or what really helped that I did, and vice versa. And let's talk about where we are and where do we think we're going next? Not in 2 years from now, but like next. What makes sense? Let's regroup. Like, okay, so our doctor said this. How do we want to think about that? What's the next step? Again, you don't want to overdo it in frequency because that can exacerbate the relational stress. But having something, the cadence, everybody's different, but I was saying like a once a month that you're giving yourselves 30, 40 minutes once a month. You have it calendared. And then third, the thing that I think is really important that goes away quickly is you're more than just this. You're more than just a couple struggling with fertility. Your marriage or your relationship is more than this. Because when you do have a child, that relationship requires you to be more than just parents together. And it can feel when you're in a fertility struggle that everything's on hold, everything. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes that doesn't need to be true. But how to create time as a couple, and this I would say once a week at least, where you're not talking about fertility. And I always tell people, like, take a walk. You don't need to like spend money. You don't need to go out to restaurants. You don't need to take a vacation. Those are all nice. I'm not saying don't do it. Like, do it. If you have an opportunity to take a vacation, like, take the vacation. But it's as simple as once a week, take a 20-minute walk together. Do not talk about fertility. Talk about how was your day? Like, what do you want next week to look like? Let's think of something fun to do. Like, what's a funny thing that happened at work or like with a friend or a family? Talk about how they did something that you loved. That is so important. The relationship needs so much of that in hard times. And to your point, Ashley, around resiliency, I mean, this is an opportunity for couples to build incredible resiliency muscles. And resiliency is the superpower of life. It's the ability for us to get through hard things well enough. Not well. We don't need to be like whistling and skipping through hard things, but well enough. And because when you're going through fertility struggles, it's fair to say you still have a lot of life to live. And it's fair to say we might face other stressors later in life. And to know that your relationship can get through something as profoundly hard as fertility struggles gives you, I mean, nothing's 100% sure in life, but it gives you a real competency as a couple. Like, we can do hard things. And so hopefully you don't have other hard things for a long time, but life is long. And, that's a gift you're giving your relationship.
It makes me think of Kelly Clarkson's playing in my head right now. Like what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so true. Like
Yeah.
you could view it in your relationship as eroding or breaking down that relationship, or you could view it as an exercise in building up this resilience. And because this certainly will not be the only hard time that a couple faces. It's one of, I think, the first major challenges. But I think as a parent, I think about how difficult some of this stuff is in parenting and
Right.
decisions that we have to make with our children. And so it definitely could be viewed, you could flip it and view it as, okay, how can we use this to like really strengthen our relationship and our communication?
That's right.
Because it certainly, that's the key here, right? Everything that you're saying is, communication about what's happening, but also communication just as a couple in life, and how was your day, and
Yeah.
taking interest in other parts of our partners.
Exactly. And it doesn't need to be like positive, like, yay, we're doing this. This is like the muscle nobody wants to build,
Yeah.
right? Like, I wish we could have just like skipped the hard stuff. And
Yeah.
yes, of course. So it's also permission giving that, this is something I say a lot. Hard isn't bad, but it's hard. And so let's not be afraid of hard, but let's not try to be like, yay, we're going to do this with a smile. You're not always. You're going to cry or scream or yell. And that's okay. You have a right to. You have a right to be angry, mad, sad, scared, all of that. This is hard. But it doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's incredibly hard. And I think that helps people move towards resiliency is like, okay, this is just really hard. And we wish we didn't have to go through it, but here we are, hard. We're going to have hard moments together as a couple. And to your point, Laura, about communication, it's also in those hard moments as a couple, understanding how each of you processes emotions. So if we're being really stereotypical, put that caveat out there, oftentimes women are more emotive with their emotions, right? Because socially we're used to talking about our feelings. It's normative, it's normalized for women and girls to be like, I feel a huge range of feelings and I feel really comfortable expressing them and sharing them with other people. So you'll see couples where the woman will be like, I'm crying, I'm yelling, I'm freaked out, I'm talking about it to him all the time. And you wouldn't even know he's also going through this. I get nothing from him. Because oftentimes, again, stereotypically, men are not taught to have a huge range of emotions, and they're certainly not socially encouraged to talk about their feelings with their friends and family. So a lot of times they're just keeping it bottled up, that occasionally will be exploding into what looks like anger or frustration, or they're just stoic because they've determined their job is, I can't get upset because it will put extra burden on her. So I just have to keep it in and be the stoic censor, right? The like guard on the side, so that I don't make it worse, which obviously is a misnomer. Because again, we're making huge generalizations, but oftentimes in these examples, she's like, I wish he would cry or yell or say how he feels. And sometimes he'll be like, I don't really need to do that. Or sometimes he'll say, yeah, maybe I'd like to talk about it instead of yell about it, but I don't want to freak you out. I don't want to make it harder for you. So I think a lot of the work we do with couples in these scenarios is really help them understand how they express and experience the emotional side of fertility challenges and struggles, whether it's a pregnancy loss or a stillbirth or fertility struggles and failed IVF, all of it, right? Like all of it. How does each person experience this? And this is not just obviously in like heteronormative couples. This is for all couples, no matter what, because people experience things differently. But really helping them understand, okay, so Sarah this is how you experience it, and Max, this is how you experience and express. And let's not try to change each other. Let's try to understand each other, so that when you are crying and Max is calm but rubbing your back, it doesn't mean he's not sad.
Yeah.
It means he might be sad, and you might need to ask him some questions, but he might be sad and comforting you. Or if Max is yelling, he might not actually be angry. He might be scared. And again, we don't just want to be like, oh, well, you get to have, but the first step is understanding, really understanding each other and your emotional needs and experiences, and accepting each other. Because from there, you make it a little safer for the other person to meet in the middle. Like, I know you're upset, but when we talk about it, can we try to stay calm? Max might say to Sarah, because when you get really animated, it freaks me out and I retreat. Okay, let's try that. Or, hey, in that like monthly walk, can you tell me how you're really feeling? I know you don't need to talk about it, but I need to hear it. These are the great conversations we can get to when first we're like, okay, I understand. We understand each other and we accept each other here.
I think because of exactly what you're talking about, and sort of, again, overgeneralizing the two sides of it, right? Like, we see this on the clinical side come across as somewhat pulling sometimes that partner into scenarios where the patient, and I hear this so many times, like, I wish my partner would show up more.
Yeah.
I wish they would be a more active part in this journey. I can't get them to sign this consent. I can't get them in for their infectious disease labs. Insert whatever as part of the journey, because
Yeah.
exactly what you're talking about. I think there's assumptions on both sides. I think a lot of times that male component or the partner component, they don't feel as involved in the process. They don't know how to process what's going on. They want to stay. They don't want to cause more. They don't want to cause more strain for their partner because they know they're going through a lot.
Right.
So I think it's so true what you're talking about on the emotional side, but then it comes across on the clinical, and back to that experience piece that you're talking about, and why the two very much mesh, and understanding that side is, we see it a lot on the clinical side, and it comes across as that. And like, the main thing people want, or we hear people want, is like, I wish they would just show up. I wish
Yeah.
they would just try and be a more active participant in, because this is a journey we're
Right.
going through this together.
And on the flip, I'll see, because we work closely with so many fertility clinics where the teams will be like, I don't know, does this guy, like, why isn't he around? And we don't want to be too judgmental at times, because sometimes it's an understanding, like, I got this, I don't need you to X or
Right.
Y. But on the flip, I think, look, we can start with, sometimes people are not on the same page, and that's why they're not showing up the same way. Whether it's, I don't really want to be doing this, I don't even know if I want to have a child, or I'm not sure this relationship feels right for me at this time. There are those bigger relational issues that can sometimes be playing out, and those are the cases we were talking about earlier, where couples already had a lot of stressors going on in the relationship before they faced a fertility struggle. And that's sometimes why we see one person just completely checked out or disengaged. On the relationships where that's not the case, where they're in a healthy, happy relationship, they are on the same page around family building. It's interesting, because I think the generation of children being raised now, the kids, my hope is, are learning about the reproductive systems in a very different way than the adults of today were taught. I find it interesting when I talk to men who have been going through fertility treatments. Their partners or wives have been doing rounds of IVF, and they still don't really understand the female reproductive system at all. It's mysterious. And it is mysterious, I guess. They just weren't it, they don't know. And it's intimidating. It's like intimidating to them. It's interesting. I've even seen some patients who are physicians themselves, obviously not in reproductive health, feel intimidated. Like, I don't know what to do here. This isn't like my world. When that's not true. This is not women's health. This is fertility health. And fertility health can be two men, two women, man, woman, non-binary. We do it all. And making people feel this is inclusive. And I think that's the other piece that couples often forget to do when they're starting, especially IVF for the first time, is having conversations. How do we want to do this together? And I think that is something that we try to do more and more and support clinics in their kind of coordinational support when patients are starting IVF for the first time is you guys need to figure out how you're going to do this as a couple, as a unit. And it is sometimes like, do we each have different roles and we're dividing and conquering? Are we going to be doing this fully collectively? Are there appointments that I think we should both make sure we go to outside of the retrieval? Where obviously, if it's a male female couple, sperm is needed as well as egg retrieval. Really, and the thing is, you don't always know that those are questions to ask. So it can be as simple as, how do we do this together? What are our expectations going in? And then that's why you have to keep talking. Be like, hey, I think I need more of you. I know you have a lot of meetings in the morning. How do we figure this out? I think I need a little bit more of you right now.
Yeah. I'm super curious as we're talking about this, and obviously we're generalizing a little bit with male, female, and heteronormative couples, but I'm curious, do you see a difference in that relationship dynamic if it is like male, female, or if you have a same-sex female couple or same-sex male coming in? Like, do you see similar dynamics with those couples?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, I would say, for same-sex couples, they need assisted reproductive technology to build their families.
Right.
So when there isn't a fertility struggle, a lot of the time this is joyful. This is exciting. This is how they're going to build their family. And when you approach it from that angle, most of the time the couples are aligned in that. But like anyone else, when there's a fertility challenge that arises in a same-sex couple, we see very similar patterns of behavior amongst the relationships, right? Where one person's less or more involved or engaged constantly. Or there's ambivalence, uncertainty, stress, shame. For queer couples, I think also for women, sometimes there's an expectation of reciprocal IVF where they're both going to go in, they're going to do a retrieval, they're going to try to make embryos using both of their eggs, and then they're going to either both carry at the same time or stagger it to build their family. And one person has a fertility problem where either they can't carry or they can't make embryos with their biology. And that's also where the relationship can, not necessarily, but can take a stressor hit.
I want to talk about the intimacy side. And we were kind of briefly talking about this before we hit record, but I think it's a really important piece because that is an important part of any relationship, right? Is that intimate connection. And when all of a sudden you're trying to conceive, you're scheduling intercourse, or you're being told by your fertility clinic you can't have intercourse for a week or two or something like that for a variety of different clinical reasons, like it becomes like, instead of just that spontaneous thing that we get to enjoy together, it becomes like it just adds that strain. It's like becomes a job. It becomes something that turns into, like, you get where I'm going with this.
Yes.
How do you sort of like talk about that with couples? How I think you can talk about it in different stages, right? Because there are, and then like after the fertility journey too, and how do you get back to that after,
Right.
hopefully you have that child or children.
Right.
There's so many different components, but would love to talk a little bit about like the intimacy side.
Great. So, fertility struggles, or not even trying to conceive, is the unsexiest thing ever. Even if you're doing it the old fashioned way and you're like timing around ovulation, it doesn't matter. When you're having sex for reproduction, it's super unsexy. And when you are doing IVF, your libido goes crash and burn. So, the first thing is like, there's nothing wrong relationally when people feel like, oh my God, I do not, or men are like, I'm just studded at this point. Like, my role is to have an erection and produce semen. So people feel really crappy. So the thing I say is, this is just a crappy type of sex or a crappy time for your libido. Not forever. Let's like commit, make a commitment to each other. This is a moment, not a forever. Like, shake on it, write a little contract, make it funny. And remembering that intimacy is not intercourse, and really starting to differentiate that. So building intimacy into your relationship doesn't have to be sex in the literal way, right? That's everything from spending time together, emotionally connecting, to touching, and from like cuddling to foreplay, right? Like all of it. Like, you can, like, where is the line that is just about pleasure and connection? And if that's where you are right now, great, then stay there, but do not disconnect. That's when we see the relational problems happen, is from we're feeling like sex is getting weaponized, or we're just so not into it, to disconnection. We're not touching, we're not talking, we're not spending time together, none of that. So it's almost like, okay, like, this is not a time where we're having a lot of sex, but how do we keep our intimacy and our connection going? And how do we make it a little playful at times or nice at times? And then, finding times where, whether you're on breaks or you're just feeling a little bit more connected sexually, where you can just be like, we're having sex just for pleasure and relational connection. This is not for fertility. That's the other piece that's really important, is like, if sex is only for reproduction, it's the fastest way to kill the sex drive in the couple. So making sure that there's also time for pleasure and sex that is not about reproduction, but just about intimacy and connection. And then I think, right, like, the next piece is sex after a baby, sex after a family. I mean, that's hard, right? Like, whether you've carried a pregnancy and your body is still repairing, or you haven't carried a pregnancy, but you've just gone through a whole lot of stuff and you're tired. And again, it's almost the same thing. It's making sure you feel connected as a couple, remembering that intimacy can be like, we're holding hands, we're kissing, we're hugging, there's foreplay, more than that. And let's figure out how to move into sex again, and to be realistic, right? Like, our sex lives in our 20s don't need to be the same as they are in your 30s and 40s, or they can be better. I have a lot of people be like, after a baby, holy moly, my libido went crazy in a good way. And their partner's like, yes. And for a lot of women, especially, their sex drive really starts to peak in their 30s. Also, women are more confident and comfortable in themselves as like sexual beings in their 30s and 40s. And a lot of couples will say like, oh my God, our sex life was fine, but now that we're done with family building, it's getting good. And I'm like, that's amazing. I love that. But it's tolerating the messiness that sex can be, right? Like, I think like we have so much fantasy going on right now. books, TV shows. Like I always joke when like shows like Bridgerton or Off Campus come out, I'm like, okay, there's gonna be a lot of talk about this in therapy because it's like written for women on like sexual fantasy, and like your partners are not gonna be these characters.
Right.
Unfortunately, they're not. And so while it's great to have fantasy, like incorporate it, also remembering that real life sex and intimacy is funny and weird and kooky and off sometimes and hot and exciting, all of it, and not expecting it just to show up as a fantasy or it's bad. And really getting playful and curious in that way is so good for couples. So we love talking about sex in therapy. We just feel like, why not? It's a great fun thing to talk about, and sometimes it's a levity that's all you've got in these moments.
Yeah.
I'm laughing. I mean, I think Ashley and I was
Yeah.
laughing for the same reason because, you know, there's like this huge boom of like fantasy romance out there right now. And so, you know, those men in those books are definitely a standard that I don't think most men can
No,
attain.
they're written by women. So these men are literally creations from women based on sexual fantasy. And there's like a formula of like what will engage 30 and 40-year-old women.
Yeah.
Describe the male character, describe the story. I mean, you know, like it's a what's the word I'm thinking of? It's like a script. You can just like script it out and you've got it. And so while it's great and it's fun, there's a sex therapist I work with, and she always says, well, you need two things. You need friction and you need fantasy. And that's really what you need. So I think these romance fantasies are awesome. Like if it helps turn you on and make you want to have sex, awesome. Go for it. Just don't expect your person to be a fictional character written by a woman.
Right.
Oh my gosh, totally. Oh. Go ahead, Ashley.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say I would love to hear like where often do you see the most breaking points? I think sex is certainly one of them, especially early on when it does become a chore, and you know you're like as the woman you're like peeing on ovulation sticks every day, and you're like, okay, tonight's night we have to have sex.
Yeah.
But I think there are other major moments. Certainly the financial piece. I remember in the clinic, there was so much contention sometimes when I would sit down with a couple and we'd be signing consent forms. And
Yeah.
it was like, okay, disposition of embryos. What do we do if one partner passes away? Who gets those embryos? And I would leave the room sometimes because there would be arguments that would happen. So I'm curious, like, to talk a little bit about that. But then again, additional breaking points in this process where you're really seeing, you know, those struggles.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why we tell people like see somebody before you start this, so you can almost like boot camp ahead of time and play out all of this, because you're just not going to know ahead of time. Like nobody knows what they don't know. I think it comes back to our couples coming into a fertility struggle or an IVF process with challenges in the relationship already. If you're not aligned and you're not communicating well and you're not able to emotionally regulate well enough, you don't have to be great at it, but well enough, this is going to make your relationship feel harder. Fact.
Yeah.
There's no way around it. So if you're already feeling resentful, and then you have to look at a contract that both of you have to sign, being like, if we get divorced, what are we going to do with the embryos? That's a recipe for conflict. If one of you is already fantasizing about like, I don't know if this is I don't know how long I'm in this. And then you have to like think about you're spending a lot of money, a lot of pain, a lot of time, and you could have to destroy or give up all your embryos. I mean, that feels like conflict. I would understand why that would be conflictual. So, I mean, I think, again, people have to be really honest about the place and time they're in their relationship. We see a lot of people just being like, well, having kids it's just the next rung on the ladder I've got to do. And they're ignoring the fact that their relationship is in a struggled, challenged place. And so they're just going through the process without being really self-aware that it's going to be really hard. And that's when we see a lot of couples come to us and we're like, oh, we wish you came to us before you started IVF, for example. But because they had so many issues beforehand, it doesn't mean the relationship's doomed. Most of the time, it's not doomed. I think most of the time, we can, they have to go through this horrible experience to actually repair all the stuff, which is fine. But really being honest about the things in your relationships that might not be serving the relationship well, and making sure you address that in an honest way. It doesn't always have to be therapy, but addressing it in an honest way before taking on something so challenging as building a family. Even if you never had fertility challenges, having children is really hard. And presumably you're intending to co-parent, and that's really hard. So even if there's no assumption of struggle, really shore up your relationship before you start family building. But if you're also going to have to navigate through fertility challenges and assisted reproductive technologies like IUIs and IVF and et cetera, get the support, be honest with each other. I think that's the big piece. And that's why I say the big thing we often do is just start with acknowledging how hard this is, and that it doesn't have to be the best time of your life. You don't have to be happy and cool about this. So let's figure out how to get through something hard together. But that takes vulnerability. And that's when we really see, couples needing a lot more support. And that's when the couples aren't, that's when the clinics are like, what's going on with this couple or this person in the relationship? Something's off. We get calls all the time from clinics, like one person's having a panic attack before the transfer or the retrieval. One person's refusing to show up for an appointment, or fights that you have to leave the room for, etc.
Yeah. What happens if one person in the relationship doesn't want to go to therapy, doesn't want to have these conversations? How do couples navigate that? Or how does the person who is wanting to therapy, how do they navigate that?
It's really hard. I mean, I think that there's so many ways to think about that, right? I think if one, and we see it a lot, where one person is in therapy and they're really doing some of the unpacking, and the other person either doesn't feel ready or for many different reasons is like, I'm not doing that, whether it's cultural, a belief system around therapy, or doesn't want to, or maybe there are deeper issues going on. I think, again, you've got to make, as an individual, some hard decisions. Is how bad is it? Can we just kind of grit through this and get through it and figure it out on the other side? Some people will say, the truth is, I want to have a child. And if we get a divorce, he still wants to be a parent. He'll be a good parent, whether or not this relationship lasts the test of time or not. And some people stop the process altogether and say, wait, I don't know if this is the person that I want to make a child with. I think that is the rarer one, truthfully. I think most people feel like they can just get through it. Maybe they're getting a little bit more of the supports for themselves in that way. And that might not be bad, right? Like, just some people aren't going to go to therapy and they're not going to verbally process things. It's harder for them. Very analytical temperament. We see this a lot in folks that go into finance and technology. Their temperament is quite literal and analytical. And for them, talking about emotions or being in therapy can feel confusing. Whether it actually is confusing, if you get the right therapist, is a different story. But it feels confusing to them. It doesn't mean they're a bad partner. It just sometimes means, this is going to be a crappy time. They're not going to show up the way I need them to. I have to adjust my expectations, and then we'll heal on the back end. We see a lot of that. And then that person just gets their supports and gets their therapy and really shores themselves up. And it doesn't mean it's a bad situation. It just means, it might not be ideally what you would wish for. And that's where you have to be really honest about who each of you are. Like I wish my husband could be someone he's not sometimes, but after 20 plus years of togethering, he's who he is, right? And I'm who I am. And,
Yeah.
nobody's perfect. And so you really have to accept the flaws and the imperfections of each other, and try to communicate and find connection and collaboration. But not everything's collaborative. And that's sometimes okay.
I think that's such an excellent point. I think one topic, and I don't mean to like be a Debbie Downer to be maybe potentially this is the last topic we talk about before we wrap, but I do think it's really important because it is seen a lot in the fertility journey, and I think a lot of our listeners potentially have experienced it, and that's loss
Yeah.
during the journey or just in general of and I think that specifically on, I mean, just individually, but on a relationship and how two individuals process that very differently,
Yes.
is a big conversation too, and could be potentially a point of contention or a point of struggle in the relationship. So I would love to hear, kind of your thoughts on this and how to help potential, somebody who may be going through that right now, trying to get back to that relationship after experiencing a loss or potentially multiple.
Yeah. We see this a lot around loss. Um, and I think the biggest thing, and it requires both communication and understanding, is there's no one way to experience grief and loss. There just isn't. And if you're not expressing it and experiencing it in the same way, it doesn't mean you're not grieving. I think being really clear that you don't have to show up in the same way. That one person might be really emotive and might be expressing their grief externally, and the other person might be feeling that same amount of grief, but really keeping it internalized. So sometimes it's just taking a stance of curiosity. How are you handling all of this? How have you been coping? Kind of, how are you thinking about that? That's a question I like sometimes. For our more analytical folks, how are you thinking about this? How are you making sense of this loss? Gives us a really good idea versus assuming they just don't care or they're not that affected. We have outside tears and inside tears. And I've not met anyone who's unaffected by loss. I've just met people that express loss in very different ways. And again, it goes back to if we're overgeneralizing, right? Like girls are taught it's okay to cry, and boys are taught, come on, tough up. So men cry much less than women, and it's terrible. And these poor guys, they're a little emotionally neutered at times, overgeneralizing. Um, and so again, they might be struggling more because they don't even know how to think about it, how to feel about it, how to express it. And again, I don't like to compare or contrast at all, but it's just the idea that just because we're not expressing it the same way doesn't mean we're not feeling it.
Yeah.
And we don't have to do it the same.
Yeah. It was, we had a conversation with somebody else, on another episode along the same lines of loss. It's slightly different, but she's had a child after multiple losses. And she was talking about like that process in and of itself. But then after having your child, I think there's this assumption that you're supposed to be happy, that you're supposed to, like, I think there's this like,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, kind of with anything, right? Like you're supposed to feel this way. You're supposed to whatever and be joyful and not experience postpartum depression because you spent years and you finally have but it's like, no, like,
Yeah, we have a group called Pregnancy After a Journey and Postpartum After a Journey, and they feed each other specifically for people that are like, okay, I'm pregnant and this is like the biggest fear of my life. You're not going to be happy. Most of the pregnancy is terrifying. You're just waiting for the shoe to drop. And then you have your baby, hooray, and you feel like crap. Women who are experiencing fertility struggles have a higher risk factor for a postpartum PMAD, a perinatal mood disorder. Men can have a postpartum experience. I like to call it adjustment disruption because it's the biggest adjustment in your life. Your relationship dynamics change. And yeah, it's really hard to just it the idea of happiness isn't, yes, obviously you're going to be happy in a meta way, but let's not expect ourselves to be happy. You don't need to be happy when you're pregnant after you've had many miscarriages. I'd be scared if you were like, hooray, I'm pregnant. It's terrifying. It's
Yeah.
And that's why a lot of people are like, I'm not going to tell people until my second trimester because I'm freaked out right now. I'm just waiting for something terrible to happen. And that's when we need partners to really support and be like, don't try to make her feel better. Don't try to encourage this. Don't try to encourage that. Let's just sit in uncertainty in a way that everybody can tolerate right now. And in postpartum, that you know, like, it's a hard time in itself, and it doesn't matter if you've worked incredibly hard to make this child come in. It doesn't mean you're not incredibly happy and grateful and dot dot dot.
Yeah.
It's also really hard and disruptive, and so more than one thing can be true at the same time. And you know, that's for relationships. At that point, we're like, don't solve the other person's problems. Don't try to come in and be the fixer. We know that's what you think is helpful, but that's not helpful. You know, we don't say it like that, of course. But we say, like, what if you asked a question versus gave a suggestion? I wonder what that would feel like to the other person. And usually they do. Well, I was like, take a crack at it. They ask the question. We prompt them a little to make it like a really broad question, not a yes no question. And then the other person will be like, oh, that felt great. Right. So, like, really helping people figure out at that stage of pregnancy and postpartum how not to be the fixer or the problem solver for the person who's struggling, but just to ask questions and figure out how to show up together.
This has been such an awesome conversation. I don't want it to
Oh,
end.
yeah.
I feel like there's so much that we could keep
Yes.
talking about because it's not a simple topic, but we are at the top of the hour. And so I would, you know, as we do every week with all our guests, we'd love to give you an opportunity, you know, to tell us a little bit more about Calla Collective and where people can find you. And then also, you know, if there's just, you know, one final thought that you'd love to leave with our listeners, you know, what that would be.
Great. So Calla Collective is Calla Collective, and you can find us. Our handle is Calla Collective HQ, and our website is www.calla-collective.com. We work in all 50 states. We also work with a lot of fertility clinics and employers and companies to really help support the reproductive experience, both for people going through it and for the support systems, whether they're medical, employers, etc. And you know, don't wait till you're in crisis. Like, come get support. It can be short-term work to just share yourself and your relationship up, figure out how to anticipate what to do, what not to do, or if there's other things going on, don't wait for a later point in your life to deal with it. Like, you're more than one thing. Deal with it all. You can handle it. And I think for couples, I think my lasting words are, you met this person and you chose to build a family with this person, not just to build a family, but because there are factors and attributes about the person you really like. And take time to enjoy those and not to just focus the time around family building, because it's hard, so you will, but also take the time. It doesn't need to be a break, but you know, create sacred time for each other as just people who care about each other.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. Batya, thank you so much for joining us today,
Thank
for giving us
you.
all this wisdom. I think it can resonate so much. We've talked about so many different topics, and on the relational piece of I learned so much too, right? You could insert a lot of what you said outside of the fertility journey too, which is super helpful because marriage in and of itself is really hard. So I hope our listeners, I hope this really resonated with you. Reach out to Calla Collective if you're looking for support. And as always, as we say every week, please like, subscribe, share, email us. We want to hear from you. What other topics should we talk about? If you have any questions for Batya or us about this topic, feel free to DM us or email us as well. We'll absolutely pass it along and answer those questions. Otherwise, we will see you all next week.
We'll see you next
Bye.
week.
Bye.
If this conversation resonated, like, comment, or subscribe, share, send us your questions. Nothing is off limits.
And wherever you are in your journey, know this: you deserve support that's real and human. Never forget to ask your questions, advocate louder, and remember, you're not crazy. Fertility is hard.
That's it for today's episode of Fertility Nurses Unfiltered. Thanks for spending your time with us today.
We'll see you next time.